Hello and welcome. Today in this hybrid tutorial, we're going to learn a bit about HTML canvas and ophthalmology so that we can make the Hermann grid. With the Hermann Grid Illusion, you should be seeing in the intersections of the grid lines little faint black dots in the periphery of your vision, and then if you look at one directly, it'll go away, and then you'll notice some more in your periphery on the other side. The grid itself will be made using HTML canvas and Typescript, and as you can see here, it is fully responsive, and we're going to work on the math necessary to make that happen. And then the rest of what we're going to do is basic HTML, and the focus on this is going to be the actual information behind how the optical illusion works. And on the way, we're going to learn a little bit of Figma to make basic diagrams like this to help us out. With all of this in mind, let's go get started. The first thing that we're going to do is look up Getting Started with Vite in Google and click on the first link that shows up from vitejs.dev. To do this, you're going to need to have npm installed on your machine. So for that, you're just going to need to look up Node.js download. So again, we're going to click on the first link. And the LTS version comes with npm pre-installed. So going back to vite.com, we're going to scroll down, and the command we're going to use, because we're going to have npm 7+ with that download, we're going to use this command here. But as you see here, the template, we don't want to be view. We want the template to be, let me make that a bit larger. We want the template to be vanilla TS, so that we just have a JavaScript project using TypeScript as the actual language that we work directly with. And if you haven't used TypeScript before, don't worry, it's pretty much exactly the same thing as JavaScript. There's no new parts to mess up that would cause it to fail when JavaScript would have worked. It just adds a little bit more tools to help us stay organized. So with that in mind, let's go to our command here, and I'm going to put my web page on the side here, and I'm going to open up the folder that I want to put it in. I want to put it into my videos folder, Optical Illusions, Hermann Grid, Code, Hermann Grid. Nope, not that one. That's the one that I used so that I know what I'm doing right now. And I'm going to call it Walkthrough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to open up my terminal. And because I'm on a Windows, for some reason to get to desktop, I have to CD into OneDrive, CD to desktop. Now that we're here, I can go to my videos folder. And then inside of there, I can go into Optical Illusions, Hermann Grid, and then I believe it was in Code. And now that I'm here, it has this one, and now I'm going to clear this, and I'm going to paste in the command. So now instead of creating a template view app, I'm going to go here, copy vanilla TS, delete view, fill it in with vanilla TS, and the name here is not going to be my view app. I'm going to call it Hermann Grid Walkthrough. And if I hit enter, you'll see I now have Hermann Grid Walkthrough right here. So now I'm going to close this. Now that we have the skeleton downloaded, I'm going to go to VS Code. I'm going to open up a new window. I'll make that full screen here, make it a little larger, and I'm going to open the folder that we just made. So on my desktop, I'm going to go to Videos, Optical Illusions, Hermann Grid, Code, Hermann Grid Walkthrough, select it, and then I'm going to open the terminal by hitting Control-tilde, which is the tilde key is in the top left corner of the keyboard. That's the squiggly key. And I'm going to write npm install. And what that's going to do is look through this package.json file and download everything we need for this project. Once that completes after about 5 seconds, now all you need to do is write npm run dev. Okay, now copy that link. Let's bring this to this side, and then let's make a new page here. Hit enter, and there's our app. Now that our app is running in the browser, I'm going to close the terminal and go to index.html and close the sidebar. As you can see right now in our app, inside the body, we only have an empty div with the ID of app and the script. that runs from main.ts. So let's go to main.ts right here, close this. And as you can see right now, what this code is doing is it's getting from the document that empty div with the ID of app, and it's setting the inner HTML of it. Let me actually make this page wider. It's setting the inner HTML of it to this HTML and setting up a counter. Right now we don't need any of this, so I'm going to get rid of everything except for the styles. And then the code that depended on was this counter.ts file. So right now, let me just check if it's referenced anywhere else. Find all references. Nope, just right here. So let's delete counter.ts as well. And now that those are gone, let's go do a CSS reset. The purpose of CSS resets is to make it so that you have more of a clean slate to develop from and styles that are more consistent across all browsers. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this and then all of this. We're not going to need any of that. And I want right now everything to have a margin of 0, padding of 0, and then box sizing of border box. And this right here is just going to make it a lot easier to size everything. And then in the body, the only thing I want this to have is a min height of 100 view height so that it spans the whole page. And then I'm going to take that and give it to the app as well, just to be safe. So yeah, what this is going to do is just make sure that any element, because star is going to select all elements, it's going to make sure that there's no weird invisible space around any of them, and that when we size them, it's kind of in an intuitive way. That's all that border box does. And then we're going to make sure that the body and app fill out the entire page. And now that we have a clean slate, let's get to using it. So I'm going to go back to index.html. Inside of the app, I'm going to put a header, and I'm going to say the Hermann Grid Illusion. And now if I hit save, we see it right here. The next thing I'm going to do is set up our canvas. We're going to give the canvas an ID of Hermann Grid, and then we're going to give it a default width and height of 200 each. And I'm going to hit the prettier button, and that's just going to auto format my code if it needs to. So right now I see that the H1 here is showing, but right now I'm not seeing the canvas, so let's make sure that it's actually on the page. So I'm going to go to the styles and just say canvas. I'm going to say its background color should be red. Okay, it is there. So I'm going to delete that. And now that we know it's there, let's go take advantage of it in main.ts. To make things neat and tidy, I usually like to make a function called main and then call that function at the end. Let's grab a hold of our canvas here by saying document.getElement by ID, and the name of that was Hermann Grid. And then from that, we can get the context. And the context is pretty much acquiring the pen that we're going to use to draw on the canvas. So if the canvas is the piece of paper, we need to get the pen to be able to draw on that paper. So I'm going to call the context ctx, and you call canvas.getContext. And as you can see, right now I'm not getting any TypeScript autocomplete, and that's because right now our code editor thinks that it doesn't know that this will be a canvas 100%. So first let me close this sidebar so we get a bit more room. I want to tell it that we do know that there is a canvas with the ID of canvas there. So it's definitely not going to be null because we know we're going to get something. And it's not just any old HTML element. So we're going to say we're going to get it as HTML canvas element. And now on that we can call .getContext. And we're going to get a 2D context because we're working in a 2D plane here. And right now if we hover over it, we're going to see that it says canvas rendering context 2D or null. But we know that this is going to work because we know we did successfully get the canvas. So I'm just going to copy this and then say as that. These here aren't doing anything. Right now it's just for TypeScript purposes so that when you hover over it, it makes it easier to get autocomplete. from it. So now you can see we have arc, arc2, begin path, and all of these context things. If we were using JavaScript and we didn't write this, you would just have to know and look up online to know what methods exist on this, but because we're using TypeScript, you just hit dot, and now we know all of the things that you could do with it. Like, for example, fill rect, which we're going to use right now to fill a rectangle on it. So I'm going to click on that one, and I'm going to say at 0, 0, which is how Canvas works, is that it starts in the top left of the canvas, and then we're going to draw a square that's 100 by 100. So I'm going to hit prettier and hit save. And there it is there. Let me go back to styles and give it a background color just to make it a little easier to see where it is on the canvas. I'm going to say it should be, I'm going to say aqua. That looks like a nice one. So right now we're drawing a canvas at the 0, 0 position in the top left corner that's 100 pixels wide and 100 pixels tall. So if I actually rewrite that just so you can see it all as we're writing it, the first argument is the x value, which again I said 0, y 0, and then width and height will be 100 each. And then our square is still there. Let's say I want to draw the square centered horizontally on the canvas. How do you think we would do that? Well, if we go to the HTML, we can see that our canvas has a width of 200, so if we want it to be in the middle, we will give this a width, we will give it a starting position of 100. But as you'll notice, it's not drawing the square in the center, it's centering where it starts drawing the square from. Because how it works is that it places the cursor here at 100, 0, and then it draws from here down. So it draws 100 across and 100 down from this top left corner. So if we want to center it, what we want to be center is not necessarily where we're drawing it from. We want the center of the square to be in the center. So if the square is 100 width wide, and we want this to be centered, we need to move it over to get this center point right here in the center of the whole canvas. And now how much is it from here to here? That would be 50 pixels because the square is 100 pixels wide. So right now if I do 100 minus 50, which is equal to 50, you'll see that the square is centered. And now if you'd like, go ahead and try to center it vertically. Again, I'll start out the wrong way and improve from there. I'll say that, hey, it's 200 pixels tall, so the center is 100. It's correct, the center is 100, but we want to draw it not from this part, we want to draw it from here in the center. So I'm going to subtract 50 from that and do this. Right now this is pretty good, but let's say that I want to make the square a little larger, and I will say I want to make it 150 by 150. So that'll make the square a little larger, and as you see, it's not centered anymore. Let me make a little more sense here. I'm going to hit this one and hit Control D so I can write both ones at the same time. And I'm going to make it 125. And if I hit save, it's not centered anymore. And it's starting to feel a little tedious to figure out how to divide this by 2 and subtract that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say that the const square side is equal to 125 and put that here and here. As you can see, nothing has changed. And let's just center this again. So right now if I do this to 100, 100, it puts the drawing point right here in the center. And so can we get that programmatically? Well, yes we can, because the canvas is 200 by 200, so width and height. And the canvas that we have here, this HTML canvas element, knows that information about itself. So I could say canvas.width and canvas.height. And that right now is going to get rid of it because it's drawing from this bottom right corner. But if I say times 0.5 to divide it by 2, let me get rid of the sidebar, and I hit save. Oop, and I got to do that for this one as well. I'm going to hit save on that, and as you see, it's drawing it at the canvas width times 0.5, so canvas width divided by 2, and then canvas height divided by 2. That's a pretty good start, as you see where it's right in the center, but what we need to do again is get half of the width and height of the square to kind of nudge it over half of it to the left and up. So right now for the x dimension here, the width of the square, let's say that this should actually be canvas.width times 0.5, and we want to bring this center point here to the left, so that's half of it. So I'm going to say minus square side times 0.5. Oops, I spelled that. Let me make that make a little more sense. So if I go back here before it was centered, and I just say, let's say minus 10 pixels, minus 15 pixels, minus 20 pixels, as you can see, the square is moving more and more to the left. And if we move it square side to the left completely, it's going to go too far. So we want to divide that by 0.5 again. And I hit the prettier button just to break everything so it's all on one line each. So if I hit save with this, it centers it horizontally. Because right now, the drawing, canvas.width times 0.5, wants to put the cursor here, and then we're going to put the cursor half of the width of the square to the left, right there. And now let's do the same for the height. Perfect. Now the square is perfectly centered. And as you may have noticed with HTML canvas, if I set it to draw right from the top of the canvas, so for the Y position right here, positive numbers actually push it down. So if I say 10, it will go down. If I say 0, it'll go back up. And if I say negative 10, it will actually continue going up. So if you want an object to go down, you need to input a positive number like 50. So let me undo that. There we go, centered again. So yeah, positive X brings you to the right, positive Y brings you down. Right now the width of our canvas is always going to be 200 no matter what, as you can see here, but I want it to be responsive with the width of the page. So right here I'm going to set the canvas.width equal to window.innerWidth. The width of the canvas is not just readable from where we can read what it is, we can actually set it to numbers. So I could actually set it to arbitrary numbers, like again it started at 200, I can set it to 500, but right now we want to set it to the window.innerWidth. And we can keep the height at 200 pixels. And as you can see right now, all of our code perfectly updated with it, where right now it knows that the width is the width we set it to up here. So the square is still centered. I think this page would look a little better with some padding around the whole thing. So I'm going to go to the Styles tab, and I'm going to go to the body, and I'm going to say padding is going to be 5 rem. I'm going to save it. Give ourselves a bit more room to look at it. And as you can see, it kind of pushed everything a little bit inside. And I think that looks pretty good just to give a little breathing room around everything. But as you see, the problem is that something seems to be a little wonky about this. It's that the canvas is still starting from here, but it's still sizing its width to be the full width of the entire page because we're using the inner width here. Which means this is actually even stretching off the page a little bit. What I want is for the canvas here to stop right here with the padding. So to get an idea of what I mean, let's just add a bunch of random words here to get that to break line. And as you see, it knows to respect that there's supposed to be, just because there's 5 rem of padding here, there's 5 rem of padding here, and this H1 knows to respect it, but right now our canvas does not. So I'm going to remove this. There we go. And if you were wondering why I used rem, rem is a unit that's similar to pixels. Usually you would say 20 px for 20 pixels or something like that, like 50 or whatnot. But rem is a bit more of an interesting unit that makes it easier to zoom in and out of the page. It's a little more dynamic. So instead of using the window, because right now when we added padding, the window hasn't changed the width, let's use the app itself. I'm going to refer to that as the container because that's what's containing the canvas. I'm going to say document.getElements by ID, and that's going to be app. And because it's an ID here on the app, you reference that with the hashtag symbol. And again, the typing for this is going to be HTML element or null, but we know that that will in fact be an HTML div element. Oops, as HTML div element. And now with that, we can say const container rect is equal to container.getBounding client rectangle. And then what that's going to do is get all of the dimensions that are relevant about that div. And we can take a look at it with this. So I'm going to console.log the container rect. Whoops. Copy just that part, paste it in, and then I'm going to open up in the DevTools here. I'm going to go to console. I'm going to make this a little bigger. Cannot read properties of null getting get bounding client rect. So it turns out that this actually was null and it wasn't found. Let me do a quick check on why that might be. Oh, oops, because when you say get element by ID, you don't need to put in the hashtag because it knows it will be an ID. Oops. There we go. As you can see, the width of this is 293. So let's go and see if we can set this to be the width of the app. So back in VS Code, I'm going to say canvas.width is equal to container rect dot width. And there we go. The reason this works is because if we go into the inspector tools, I'll put this on the bottom so it doesn't mess with anything. I'll drag this up. You can see right now we have the body, which is just the entire web page. We have the div with an ID of app in it, and then inside of that we have our h1 and canvas. So right now the body, we gave a padding, so you can see the padding here. And in this case 5 rem turned into 80 pixels. It's saying all of this space is reserved. Anything inside the body actually goes within that sort of invisible border around it. And so the app is the content that's inside of that, and that one there has this width. And right now if we get rid of the padding on the side, so if I do that, you'll see the body again is just the entire thing, the entire web page, and the app is just the same thing. So if we bring it back, the body sort of restricts what area inside of it can be used, and the app is that space right now. And we're measuring the width of that. And then we're setting the canvas width to be the same as this. So right now you can see this is 793 wide for the app, and we're making the canvas the same here. So I'm going to close this and go back to our file to get back to work. I'm going to give ourselves a little more room to code here. Hit save on that. I'm going to remove this console.log. And this logic here is all for sizing it. So I think we can actually make this a little cleaner and make a function here called resize canvas. And that's going to take our canvas, which is of type HTML canvas element. And then we're going to copy and paste this, delete it, and put it inside here. So now, if we call resize canvas and pass it in our canvas, it should work. Cool. So right now with this function, resize canvas, we're passing it the canvas, which we've typed here, so that inside of this, we do know that it is an HTML canvas. We are finding the container, the app inside the document, and document.getElement by ID just has it where the element, the div is on the web page, and we just want to be able to kind of hold it in our hands in JavaScript here just so that we can take a look at it and do what we need to do with it. So we're going to take that here and put it into the container variable, and then we're going to call the getBounding client rectangle method on that, and that's going to give us an object. It's DOM rect which is going to have information on its position and its width and height and all that. And we're going to set the canvas width equal to its width. So now the canvas is just as wide as the div that's containing it. We can clean up this file even more by going over here, and we're going to create a logic folder that's going to contain all of our logic inside of it. And we'll put in a file for just all logic that has to do with canvas. And we're going to say .ts. And we're just going to take this guy here, delete it for now. I'm going to say export and then paste it. So now it's the same exact thing, except beforehand we're just going to write export. And that's going to allow us over here to import it. And we're going to import resize canvas, hit tab, hit save again. As you can see, nothing's changed, but it looks a lot cleaner right now. So we're getting our canvas in context. Let me get rid of that. And then we're resizing the canvas, and then we're just making a rectangle on it. And now this square here is pretty cool, but I think we want more. So let's start setting up the Hermann grid. First of all, we're going to need to get rid of this here because we want a white background. We're going to make that white. And then back to the main file. Let's delete all of this for now. And let's say that our square side is going to be equal to 50 pixels wide and tall. And then I'll just quickly do the same thing again, where I'll fill rect and I'll say 0, 0, square side, square side. Now that puts it in the top left corner. The question is, how many squares can we fit that are 50 pixels wide in this box? The answer to that, of the amount of squares that can fit in the x dimension, is equal to the canvas.width divided by the square side. So right now let's pretend that this grid is 200 pixels wide. The amount that could fit there would be 4 squares, because 200 pixels divided by 50 is equal to 4. 50, 100, 150, 200. And we can do the same for the y. So amount of squares y, and that's going to be equal to canvas.height divided by square side. And now let's just use the amount of squares x. I'm going to say for let I equals 0, I is less than amount of squares x, I plus plus, const x is equal to, oops, I don't know why I said if, I meant for. Const x is equal to, let's say, the square dimension, which is square side, times I. And then let's fill the rectangle inside there. And let's assign it to x. Oops, x. Right now it looks like we just have a horizontal bar going across. And let's investigate why. Let's say, I'm just going to make it I. And as you can see, instead of making it 0, it made it just a little wider. Because right now for the amount of squares, let's say if it's 10 squares that can fit in this, I'm going to guess something around that. It's drawing a square, and it is drawing it from the starting position. The first one's going to start at 0, 0. The next one's going to start at 1 pixel on the x dimension. Then 2 pixels, 3 pixels, 4 pixels, and then it's done. So the last square that was drawn was actually drawn starting like here, for example. But when we do this code here, and we're going to replace the x back here, we know each square is 50 pixels wide, and so the first square at I is equal to 0 is going to be drawn at 50 times 0, because that's where it starts. So it's going to fill a rectangle in at x at 0, 0, which is going to draw it right here. And the next square, because it's going to increment and run this loop again, I is going to be equal to 1 at that time. So the x position is going to be 50 times 1, so the x position it starts drawing from will actually be here. And then we'll draw a square that size, and then I plus plus will happen, and I will be equal to 2. And so square side times 2 is going to be equal to 100, and then it'll fill it at 100 pixels, and so on. This is good, but I think I'd want a bit of a gap between these squares. So I'm going to make a variable const gap and set it equal to 10. And let's just throw a plus 10 on this and see what happens. Okay, right now it seems to be doing this first for each one, and then just adding 10 pixels here, so the whole Congo line is pushed to the right. But what I want to happen actually is have it where I want the square side plus the gap first to be done together, and then multiply times I. And so now what's happening is, let's go through it again. It's going to start at I is equal to 0, so of course first one's going to be 0. But then let's increment I++, and now we have I equal to 1. So right now, square side plus gap is now equal to 60 pixels. And so it's going to be 60 pixels times 1, which is going to put it here. Because 50 times 1 would want to draw it here, but then what we're going to do is we're going to add 10 to it to push it over just a little bit. So rather than drawing at 50 pixels, it's going to draw it at 60 pixels from the left. And then when I is equal to 2, it's going to say 60 pixels again, because square side plus gap, and then it's going to multiply that by 2. So it's going to be, again, 50 pixels plus 10 pixels. That's now 60 pixels this one's drawn from, and then this is going to draw 50 pixels, which now makes it 110, but we want it to be drawing at 120, so we're going to add 10 pixels for that gap right here. And as you can see, we can play around with it. We can increase the gap if we want, or we can decrease it, and then we can also increase the square side. And right now you can see that it's overflowing. I want amount of squares x to be the amount of whole squares that can fit here. So what I'm going to do here is write math.floor, so that if we have any decimal points of how many squares, because right now we can fit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8.5 about. I want to just round that down to 8. So I'm going to say math.floor, and that does not appear to have worked. The reason for that is because we're not taking the gap into account here. So just like we're doing square side plus gap here, the amount of space we're actually taking up per square is not just 50 pixels anymore. Each square actually takes up 60 pixels because each one comes with an associated gap. So we're going to add that gap right here. So right now, with this logic, we know that we can only fit this amount of squares here, and that another square here would get cut off. So if I again take off the math.floor, you can see it's going to put in that extra square that could fit, but we're going to cut that one off. Now let's do the same logic over here. I'm going to wrap it in parentheses and say math.floor, and then wrap this in parentheses and say plus gap. I started with the amount of squares x at I, but it's usually best to start with the rows first and count down. So I'm going to comment out this for now and use it so that we can just pretty much copy it here and say let I is equal to 0, I is less than amount of squares y, and then I++, and then for let j equals 0, j is less than amount of squares x, j++. There's really no reason for the words I and j. Right now it's just to keep track of the amount of squares that fit along the y. So right now it's looking like 3 squares would fit, and then about 10 squares in this direction. And then we're going to fill the rectangle here. And we're going to calculate the x and y. So right now we're using I with the y. So I'm going to actually say y for this one. And then x is going to be the same thing with j. And that should be x. So now if I put in x and y, oh, I guess only 2 could fit. So let me actually decrease this a bit. There we go. And something we could do here is that we actually don't need to calculate the y inside of here. We only need to calculate it every single time that the row changes here. Oops, I hit Command B, I want Command V. There we go. Everything's the same. So right now, the amount of squares y, the value of that is definitely 3 here. And we're going to start it off saying I equals 0, and we're going to say y is definitely 0 here. So it's starting a y value of 0. And then at that height, because we're going to keep that constant, we're just going to loop through this here, the amount of squares x, and just as before, we're going to keep recalculating the x position And we're going to create rectangles at increasing values of x as this continues to loop. And so it's going to go to the right. And as you can see, the value of y is remaining constant, but then what's going to happen is once it gets to the amount of squares of x, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, it's going to reach the end of this for loop. And so we're going to get out of here, and then we're going to reach here, the end of that line, and it's going to trigger I++, because this is j. It's going to trigger I++, which is going to start this outer for loop again, and it's going to increment the y value to now start here in this middle row, and then it's going to loop through the x values again and make that row, and then it's going to get out of here, and then it's going to start the for loop again, calculate the last row, the last height of the row here, and then it's going to loop through this one final time and give us that row. So right now I'm going to delete this and hit prettier and hit save, and nothing's different and all looks good. Right now, as you can see, there's a lot of empty space to the right, and it's just kind of pressed into the top left corner. What I want is to divide this kind of empty space here by 2 and put half of it here and half on the other side, which will center it right in the middle, and do the same for the vertical. So to get that empty space, what we can do is we can say const extra x for the extra x space and say it's the canvas.width, and instead of dividing it, we're going to get the remainder. Because right now the math.floor is going to say, give us the whole number beneath where you are. So if it's 8.4, it's going to round it down to 8. If it's, 8.7, it's still going to round it down to 8. What I want is access to that 0.4 or that 0.7. So using the modulo gives you access to that remainder that math.floor gets rid of. And it's going to be the same thing here of square side plus gap. Now let's try out using that. So in the x here, I'm going to try saying here plus the extra x. That seems to be working, but what we're going to want to do is actually divide that all by 2 then, because right now it's just putting all the gap on this side rather than that side. Divided by 2. Okay, that looks good, but as you can see, it's still not perfectly centered, and it has to do with that gap adding up. So if I get rid of that, you'll see that it's not putting it all the way to the right. It's actually still leaving that gap right here. So what we want to do is actually divide that gap by 2. So I'll bring it here, and what we're going to actually want to do is add right here plus gap divided by 2 again. Just kind of push it over a little bit more by half of that gap. And there we go. Now it's perfectly centered. I'm going to say const extra y is equal to canvas.height modulo square side plus gap. We're going to divide that by 2. And then we're also going to add half of that gap again, just to push it over just that little nudge more. Ooh, and that did not work. Oh, because we're not using it yet. And I'm going to add extra y right there. And now it should be perfectly centered. So if we resize the screen a little bit, you'll see it doesn't update on resize of the page, but if I do refresh, you'll see it recalculates it correctly. And you can see now there's more squares, and now there's less. Because it knows to each time I refresh it to recalculate how many squares could fit. And if I increase it just a little more, you'll see it'll just give it's not enough space to give a new square yet, but so it'll just use that extra space to add some padding on the left and right sides. Let me actually move these to the left side. This is just subjective. Personally, it looks a little better to me, just to have that on the left, so that we have all the calculations that we need on this side, and then just multiply it by the index of which square we're talking about. And now that we have it, based on your screen size, you can start adjusting these square sides and gaps to make it where you can see the illusion. So right now I'm going to check at 40, 60, nah, that's not. I'm going to go with 50, maybe have a gap of 15, increase the gap. Okay, I'm seeing the illusion more. I'm seeing the black hazy dots in the middle of the intersections. I'm seeing that a bit better. Adjust it however looks best for you. Actually, I think what we had originally looks best for me, so I'm going to keep it at that. You know what? I'm actually going to make that 12. There we go. This looks best for me. You adjust these numbers to what looks best for you. And now all of this logic here, all this draw logic, we can actually make a function for that. And I'm going to call that const draw grid. And that's going to take the canvas, which is an HTML canvas element. And inside of there, oops, I don't have that copy and pasted. I'm just going to take all of this, delete it, put it here. We're going to lose our grid for now, but I'm going to just call this right here, draw grid canvas. Ooh, and it looks like we don't even need the context here anymore, and we do need it here. So I'm actually just going to take this and put it at the top here. Hit prettier, save it. Now the grid's back. Let me go copy that. Go to our canvas logic file, paste this here, export it from that file, and copy that. And then I'm going to import it from here. And now everything's back to normal and the code looks way cleaner. As you can see, super simple. We're getting the canvas from the HTML, we're resizing it, and then we're just drawing a grid with it. So right now, this is all of the logic that we need to draw the Hermann grid. As you can see, if I hit refresh, it always makes it the right size. But it would be nice if it did that by itself without me having to refresh the page manually. To accomplish that, we could write window.addEventListener, and again, this is why I like Typescript so much. I'm going to say resize, and as you see, it's already there, ready to go for us. And we're going to make a little function here. And this function is going to run every single time that the user resizes. So right now, I'm just going to say console.log resizing, and I'm going to open up in inspectors, go to the console. As you'll see, nothing's happened yet. I'm refreshing the page. It's resizing the canvas and drawing the grid, but when I resize the entire page, oops, gotta click on that, you'll see that as I'm doing it, it's calling that function over and over. Right now I'm not changing anything, and it's not doing anything, and as I change it, it's resizing and calling that function. So right now in this function, all I want it to do is resize the canvas and draw the grid. So each time that we resize the page and change the dimensions of this page, it's going to keep calling this function over and over again, which is going to resize the canvas and then draw the grid on it over and over again as I do this. So right now, as I click this and hold it and drag it, as you see, right now it looks smooth, but it's actually calling that function over and over and over again as I do this, and it looks pretty smooth. And now this logic actually looks pretty extractable as well. I could say const setup Hermann grid, and put in all of that logic there. Oops, it's got to take the canvas, which is an HTML canvas element. And then right here, set up the Hermann grid with that canvas, like so. And then this actually can go into the helper file. So I'm going to put that at the bottom here, export it, hit prettier, import it here. And right now we actually don't need any of that anymore. And look how clean that file is right now. We're going to create a canvas, we're going to pluck it from the HTML, and we're going to pass that into our setup Hermann grid function. And we're going to go here, and it's going to resize the canvas, which is this function we did again, which is just going to say, hey, how wide is the app right now, the div that contains this canvas, and just set the canvas width to that. And then it's going to call the draw grid function, which is going to do all that logic we had, getting our pen, and then drawing it all to the canvas using these square dimensions that we have here of the actual size of the square and the gap between the squares, how many squares we can have on the X and Y dimension, how much extra space is left over, including the gap, and then just looping through the amount of squares y and then x, and just doing it one row at a time. So starting here, going across, incrementing the y, going down one, going across, incrementing the y, going down one, going across. And then we're going to add some event listeners to make sure that we're just going to do that same thing again whenever the user increases or decreases the page width. And that right there is all of the computational logic and software development knowledge that's needed to create this optical illusion using HTML canvas. But on this channel, I want to talk a little bit computer science and a little bit biology. So let's get into that. Let's head to index.html so that we can write down the explanations of why this is happening. One quick thing I'm going to do is just change this. Instead of being 200 by 200, I want it to be 400 by 400, just to get a bit more of the illusion here. The first thing we should do to introduce people to this optical illusion is to explain what they should actually be seeing. So here, I'm going to write an explanation, I'm going to hit prettier right now, about what the user should be seeing. And they should notice faint dark spots in the intersections of the grid in the periphery of their vision. If you try to look at anyone directly, it vanishes. The most sensible thing to wonder after that is, why does this happen? And the most common explanation for this is called lateral inhibition. And the primary driver of this is retinal ganglion cells. And you may be wondering what retinal ganglion cells are. What they are, if we look up on Google, is that they are neurons that connect the retinal system to the visual processing centers within the central nervous system. So if we go to images to look at it, I'm going to go to the right here. And you can see that we have photoreceptors here that receive light, and multiple of these photoreceptors feed in through a few intermediate cells like bipolar cells, and they feed into retinal ganglion cells. So I actually like this photo a lot. And we're going to explain a little bit more what retinal ganglion cells are in a bit, but right now I'm just going to open this in a new tab, and I'm going to download this image. And I want to save it to, again, my videos folder, optical illusions, Hermann Grid, code, Hermann Grid walkthrough, public, and then there's nothing in public right now, so I'm just going to put that there, and I'll call it retinal ganglion cells. Save, and if we open this up, it should be right here. There we go. And I'm going to put a picture of it right down here. So I'm going to say figure, and then I'm going to create an image element here, and the source of that is going to be / retinal ganglion cells.jpg, I believe it was. There we go, there it is. And then I'm going to say that this is just retinal ganglion cell diagram. As the alt tag, I'll go back over here, give ourselves a bit more room. And then right now, because we got this picture online, we want to credit the authors of this. And right now, this photo, it comes from a scientific study, so we're going to cite the people who did this. So I'm going to add a fig caption here. I'm going to hit save on that. And there's the caption there. So let's go over a little bit more about what retinal ganglion cells are. And then as we type to make it a little easier for ourselves, we could just call them RGCs. And what they are is a type of neuron in the eye that receive information from photoreceptors via two intermediary neuron types: bipolar cells and amacrine cells. I'm going to hit prettier. Okay, so as we said beforehand, retinal ganglion cells seem to receive input from multiple photoreceptors. And again, photoreceptors are the first cells that receive light from the outside world and turn that into action potentials to transmit to later neurons. But as we said beforehand, that it's not just when light hits one photoreceptor, that signal gets propagated downstream and it hits one retinal ganglion cell, and then that gets sent to the brain for processing. It's actually that one retinal ganglion cell receives input from multiple photoreceptors, and this makes up the RGC's receptive field. And so when photoreceptors in the center of this receptive field detect an increase in luminance, meaning that more light is shown onto the center of this cluster of photoreceptors, they send excitatory signals to the RGC to get it to fire its own signal towards the brain, letting it know that, hey, there's something there. However, the photoreceptors on the outside of this photoreceptor cluster send inhibitory signals to the RGC when they detect more light, trying to get the RGC to not fire. Right now, this diagram and explanation might be a little complex, so let's explain it visually with Figma. Right now I have a tab open, and again, a Figma account is completely free to make, so I highly suggest you make one. Right now I'm going to focus on this a lot more, so I'm going to make this way larger, and I'm going to draw a frame. So right now what I want to do is show the path of information from light to the retinal ganglion cell and what that actually does to the activation of it. I'm going to start off by drawing some arrows that are going to face straight to the right, and what I'm going to do is make them yellow because they represent light. I'm going to make them way thicker, and I'm going to change the type. Let me zoom in here. I can't zoom in on Figma, so I hope you can see this well. But thankfully Figma is very intuitive to use, and I'm going to change the type of triangle to be like that. And right now that yellow is a bit hard to see, so I'm going to darken it a bit, maybe make it a little more orange-ish. Okay, I think that's easier to see. Right now I'm going to make it a little shorter so we have a bit more room for some other parts of the diagram and push it a little to the left. And I'm going to hit Control D to create a new one. And then I'm going to place it right here. I'm going to hit Control D again, and it should just place a new one at an equivalent distance, and I'll hit Control D again, and now we have 4 light bars going in. I'm going to add a text box here saying light, and that should be way larger. So I'm going to go to the font size and make that 40, make that 60. I think 80 is good. And then what I'm going to do also is give it a fill the same color. So I'm going to go here, copy the color, click here, hit Command V there, hit enter, and that makes it pretty hard to read. So I'm going to add a black stroke to it and increase that a little bit. And I think that looks pretty good. So right now we have light going in, and we're going to say that it enters the eye. And the first thing that it's going to encounter are many of these rectangles, and those are called photoreceptors. I'm going to make those purple. I'm going to do the same trick of where I hit Command D to duplicate it. I'm going to hold Shift, and holding Shift makes it so that it keeps it in just a perfect perpendicular plane, either up and down or left and right. But I want it to be down. I'm going to put it right here, and I'm going to hit Command D a few times to add a whole bunch of them. I'm actually going to delete this top one to give us a little more room. Then I'm going to hit Control C, Control V on this light, and hold Shift to drag it across the plane. And then for this, I'm going to give it a fill color of purple. So now these are photoreceptors. I'll move that to the left. And this should probably all be a little smaller. Let's actually make this size 60 font. Just so that we have room for everything. And I'll center these. Whoops. And now, less importantly for us right now, I'm going to just copy this by hitting Control C, Control V, and drag it across. Each of these does have an intermediate cell. And those don't really matter to us much. So I'm just going to fill it in kind of like a light blue. There we go. And I'm going to hit Control D. Same trick. Actually, something we could do is I'm going to delete this. Since it's so similar to this, I'm going to copy all of this, paste it, and then drag it over here. And then can I just make everything here light blue? I can. Cool. So let me Control C, Control V that. And for these, I'm just going to call these intermediate cells. And I'll make this here light blue. So So right now we have light going into each photoreceptor, which transmits it to the intermediate cell to its right, and those are all going to go into a couple retinal ganglion cells. So I'm going to hold shift here so I can make a perfect circle, because if I don't hold shift, it'll do this. So I'm going to hold shift and make this here, and this will be our retinal ganglion cell, and I'm going to make this a fill of red. And then what I'm going to do is Control D, drag it down a little bit, Control D again, put one over there. What I want to do now to show that each of these retinal ganglion cells receive inputs from multiple photoreceptors, I'm going to use the pen tool here, and I'm going to click once here, and then I'm going to click once here, and that should draw a line. And right now with that line, I'm going to make it red, and I'm going to increase the thickness to about 15. I'm going to bring this in a little bit. I'm going to click the pen tool again. I'm going to click here, and then I'm going to drag it to give it a bit of that shape here. And now that we have this here, I'm going to Control C, Control V, and right now there's two of them in the same position. And I'm going to right click it, and then I'm going to flip it vertically. And right now that's going to flip it like that. I'm going to hold shift and drag it down, and then I'll put it right there. And then I'll adjust this just a little bit, put it over there, and I'll adjust that to go into the circle and center the circle a little more. And actually I'll just delete these, and then I'm going to highlight over all this, hit Control D, hold shift, drag it down, hit Control D and drag it down. There we go. And then finally I'm going to copy this, drag it over, and say retinal ganglion cells. I'll capitalize this one here too, and then make this here red. And right now, let me zoom in a little bit by holding Control and scrolling in. Right now what happens is that you can see that in the eye there are many of these photoreceptors, and right now we have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's say, that are feeding into this one retinal ganglion cell. The signal from, let's say, these two photoreceptors feed into this dendrite of the retinal ganglion cell. And so these two, if more light comes in specifically right here, let me undo that, those ones are going to have a positive effect on this signaling. So I'm going to take a text box here, and I'm going to click right here and write plus, because right now this here is a positive signal. But if light comes in specifically here or here more, both of these here and here do feed into this retinal ganglion cell, but the information is going to these side dendrites here. And if I go reverse this to get the light back in the same place, these side dendrites then, if I copy this and put it here, these ones are actually inhibitory and will try to stop this retinal ganglion cell from firing. I'm going to put that here. So if light comes in through here and goes, and the signal gets sent through mostly to this dendrite right here, it's going to tell the retinal ganglion cell, hey, something is in this position in your vision. Go tell the brain that, and we're going to go see what that is. But if the light comes in here or here, it's going to feed into the inhibitory part and say, hey, don't tell the brain that anything is here. Let's just pretend that nothing is in this part of the vision. And now that I have this, actually, I'm going to do the same thing of copying it again. I'm going to delete these two, and then hitting Control D on this, I'm going to drag it down just because it has those annotations on it, and then I'll hit Control D again. I think this is a good diagram so far that hopefully makes this make more sense. Let me know if in the comments if any of this doesn't make sense, and I'll try to give a good response. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to export this frame here. So I'm going to go click on the frame, and let's call it right now RGC. And right now I have other RGC pre and luminosity pre because those were the diagrams I made beforehand so that I know what I'm doing for recording the video. But I'm going to hit enter on that, and then I'm going to export this. and I'm going to export it as an SVG. And then right now that's going right up here. And so I'm going to go to VS Code here and open up our public folder. Here it is. I'm going to take that, not my bookmarks. I'm going to take this, and it's the rgc.svg. I'm going to drag that right into the public folder. And now we can return to VS Code to see if we got that working. So I'm going to go back here, and let's see. So right now the SVG, the reason I chose that to be exported as an SVG, not a PNG or whatever, is because an SVG is actually just math. All of this is the representation of what we just drew. And because it's just math, that means you can zoom in and you'll never see any pixels because the browser is just going to recalculate how it should look at any zoom level. But for a JPEG, you could just keep zooming in, and as you see here, you can see that line is starting to pixelate, but that's never going to happen with an SVG. So let's go over to our index.html and make some space here. And again, I'm going to make a figure. I'm going to make an image, hit tab, and the source is going to be slash, I think I just called it rgc.svg, and then the alt is just going to be a retinal ganglion cell diagram, and then I'm going to hit save. I did not get that right. Oh, it's all caps. RGC. Save. And there it is there. It is very large, but we'll add some styling later to fix that. And then let's add a quick little Fig caption to explain what's going on. Right now, I'm just going to say that the signals from multiple photoreceptors feed forward into one retinal ganglion cell. You know, and something I do want to say as a note, and that we should probably write this here in the caption, is that technically this isn't right where the human eye has it, where it's weird, where it's backwards, where the photoreceptors are actually in the back of the eye, and all of this lays on top, and the light is actually coming in from the right, and it passes through these cells and hits the photoreceptor, and then sends the signal this way, and then it sends it back that way to the brain. But squid eyes technically work this way, where light comes in, hits the photoreceptors first, and then that just goes all the way straight to the brain this way. So we're talking about this in people because people are supposed to use this app, not squids. So I'm just going to write a little comment here to elucidate that. I'm going to say diagram is showing direction of information. Light actually comes from the right in humans. And I'm going to hit prettier, just to be a little more truthful in what we're showing here. Let me give ourselves a bit more room to think here. So now let's explain how this actually results in us perceiving this optical illusion. Let me scroll up so we can see it. What I'm going to say is that the intersections have more areas of intense luminosity around them compared to points in the middle of a grid line. So right now, if we actually look at our Hermann grid here, you can see right now this intersection. Let's say that the center of this is the center of one of your receptive fields, meaning that a cluster of photoreceptors are controlling how you perceive this area of your vision right here. The photoreceptors are being activated specifically here in the center and a lot here around it as well. And the light from the white here, because again, a lot more light is coming from the white than the black here, the light at the center of the receptive field is going to the RGC and saying, hey, there's a lot of light coming from here. You should tell the brain that this looks like it's white here. But as you can see to the immediate right, top, left, and bottom of this central point here at the intersection, there's a lot of white here too, and that is triggering the photoreceptors on the edge of the receptive field. And those are telling the RGC, hey, don't tell the brain that there's actually some light here, that there's white light coming in right here. And so at this point then, that means the center here is trying to tell your brain, look, there's white light coming in here, and you have 4 places saying, hey, RGC, don't tell the brain that there's white light coming in here. So 1 saying there's light, 4 places saying there's none. But now let's compare that to, let's say, this center part of the row here. Here in your vision, if you see it in your periphery, and it's controlled by a receptive field, The center of here, it's saying, hey, activate the RGC. Tell the brain that there's a lot of light coming in from here. And on the left and right of it, because it's also really bright white, it's saying, hey, RGC, don't tell the brain that there's things going on here. But it's only on the left and right. There's not much luminance coming here from the top or the bottom from these black squares. These areas are not activating the peripheral photoreceptors that are controlling the RGC. So that means here you have one area saying, hey, this is white, and you have two areas saying, ignore that, it's not, don't go to the brain and tell you that this area is white. But here you have four sections saying that it's not white here. So that's why your vision may appear darker here at the intersections. Is again, just because you have more stimulus to the outside of the photoreceptors in the receptive field at the intersections. So again, with this one, it's a little complicated, so we're going to explain it visually with Figma again. But let's go back to the text and just finish reading it. So as I said, the increased peripheral luminosity at the intersections trigger more of the photoreceptors at the edge of the receptive field, causing it to be less activated, and thus the area of vision it controls appears darker compared to the areas not in the intersections. Because again, you only have immediately left and right saying, hey, this is darker. But here you have 1, 2, 3, 4 telling you, hey, this central area is darker. But again, we're visual creatures, so let's go back to Figma, and we're going to increase this. And I'm just going to copy this frame. I'm going to paste it and put it right over here. When I pasted it, it just went to the left automatically, so I'm going to click on that one, and I'm going to call this luminosity. And then right now in here, I can actually just delete everything. So I'm just going to highlight everything, holding shift, and delete. So right now, let's make a mini version of our Hermann grid. I'm going to hold shift to make a perfect square, because if I don't hold shift, it's going to make it do that. So I'm going to hold shift, and I'm going to make a square. I'm going to make it black. I'm going to put it right over here, and I'm going to hit Control D, bring it to the right, hit Control D again, and then I'm going to highlight all of these, hit Control D, drag it down, and then hit Control D again. And there we go, there's our Hermann grid. I'm actually seeing the optical illusion a bit here. So right now, I'm going to draw a circle and say that this here is the center of one of your receptive fields. I'm going to make it light blue. I'm going to change the blue color to be a bit more, there we go, a bit more vivid. And then what I'm going to do is change the stroke of it. The inside stroke, I'm going to bring that, I think, up. Oh, actually, I can make this white. And then I can make that, I want that previous color, actually. Let me get that, copy that. I'll write white here. And then I'll make that blue, the stroke. And then, because I just want it to be a little ring here, I think that just looks nice. There we go. So this is the center of one of your receptive fields. And this blue ring here is excitatory. It's telling your brain, hey, inside here, this is the color white. And this here is, actually what I could do is tone down the transparency to 0%. So there we go. So now this is actually showing the background. So if I put it here, it's black. So what this is doing here is saying, look at the light inside of this ring. It's pretty bright here. It's the color white. That's a lot of activation of these photoreceptors being fed straight to the retinal ganglion. Right now, if there's a photoreceptive field right here, it's not getting much activation because it's over the color black, and that's not giving it much luminosity. But right now we're going to talk about a receptive field that's hypothetically centered right here. And this here is sending it excitatory signals. But if I copy this and I drag it to the right, this here is actually inhibitory. And then let me copy this and paste it, and I'll put one right here. And I'll do the same thing again. Put that over here, Control C, Control V, and I'll put that over here. These areas here are inhibitory because these areas are getting activated by the white light here and are still part of this receptive field here, but because they're on the edge, they're actually sending inhibitory signals to the retinal ganglion that controls all of these photoreceptors. And they're saying, hey brain, there really isn't that much light coming from this area. So tone down how bright you perceive this area right here in the center of this blue circle to be. And now contrast that with over here. So I'm going to copy this and drag it to the center here. Right now, if a receptive field controls this area, it's only receiving inhibitory signals from directly to the right of it and directly to the left of it. Again, there's nothing being activated here because this is black over here. So I'm going to delete that. And so now you can visually see how many votes are happening in this receptive field in a way. You can see that you have one strong central vote saying, I'm getting a lot of light here, but the outer side too, because these are getting activated by the light, send signals to the retinal ganglion cell saying, hey, this area isn't actually, don't perceive it to be as bright as you think, but it's only 2 of them. Versus here, the center here, you have 4 of these areas on the periphery of it saying, hey, RGC, don't activate that much because there's really not that much going on here. And so that is why these intersection areas appear to be darker than the center areas of the columns and rows. Let's now just add some quick labels here. So I'm going to say excitatory, and then I'm going to have, I like that color blue. So I'm going to now draw an arrow using this here to this one. I'm going to make it that color blue. And I'm going to make it thicker. There we go. Then I'm going to copy this and drag it over here and say that these ones are inhibitory. And I like that arrow, so I'm going to copy it. Start it from there and point it right to that one and make it red. And I'm going to Control C, Control V, and then that one, the other one's going to point over here. And there we go. Same thing, I'm going to click on this frame and I'm going to export it as an SVG. And then now that we have that, I'm going to open this up here and I'm going to drag in luminosity.svg over here. I'm going to expand this again and then go to index.html and do the same thing. I'm going to just copy and paste one of these figures since we've done it a few times before. And I'm going to change this to be luminosity.svg. And then I'm just going to call this alt tag visual explanation of lateral inhibition. I'm going to hit the prettier button to put that on multiple lines. I'm just going to capitalize these and then copy it and use it as the fig caption as well. So let's take a look at what we have. Okay, it looks good, but a little disorganized. Let's get to fixing that. So because we're going to focus on styles, I want to see more of the page here. And where we're going to need to go next is the styles.css. So I'm going to close this and let's see what we can do here. In the app, I'm going to display flex, which will initially put it all in a very long row, but I want it to be in a flex direction of column, so it's top to bottom, not left to right. And so that looks pretty much the same as what we had beforehand. And now I can do a few extra nifty things like align items center, just to center everything from top to bottom. So without this, as you can see, I'm going to comment this out. Everything's left aligned. Now everything is right in the middle. And then I'll add a bit of spacing between these. I'll say 3 rem should look good. There we go. That is now way easier to read already. But quite obviously, I think we need to style these photos to be a bit more of a reasonable size. Let me scroll down to the worst offenders right here. All of these images are kept in a figure element. So if I go to index.html, I'll keep that open for now. You can see that the image is wrapped in a figure element, which is pretty much just a semantic div. It's pretty much just a div behind the scenes. But I'm going to take that figure and say it should have a width of 50 view width. Okay, that's a little better already. Let me give the page a little bit more room. And then I'm going to say it has a max width of, I'll say 600 pixels. just because I don't want the photos to get too big if we want a really large screen. And again, I'll say display flex just because that makes it so easy. Flex direction column. There we go. And just writing these two commands already seem to size the photo really well so far. And it's just because when we set the flex direction to column, right now it still looks really bad if I don't have that. But if I set the flex direction to column, it now makes it so that it's called the cross axis is to the left and right. And it makes it so that it fills out perfectly the width of the parent container, which is going to be a max width of 600 pixels, but otherwise it's going to be 50% of the view width. I want to add a little bit of spacing between the fig captions, so I'll just say gap of 1 rem. There we go, just to give it a little breathing room, but still give it less space than between the paragraphs so that you know that this caption is associated with the photo. And then I'll just do some quick styling on the paragraph tags. I'll just give those a slightly bigger font size of 22 pixels. There we go, a little more readable. And then I'll give them a width of 50%. And there we go. And with that, we're done. And let's go take a look at everything we've done. The first and most computationally complex part was actually creating the Hermann Grid Illusion. And we made some pretty good clean code for that. So right now, all of that happens in this canvas with the ID of Hermann Grid. And it all goes down in this main.ts file. And so we just grab the canvas from the document, and then we just set up our Hermann Grid by resizing it, and then drawing it and setting up event listeners so that if we were to resize the screen, it will dynamically adjust, looking just as if CSS was doing it, just like it's resizing all of this. And then after we finished setting this up, we turned our attention to the biological reason of why this is happening. And we learned that the most predominant theory is called lateral inhibition, which is caused by retinal ganglion cells, which are, once again, cells that receive information from photoreceptors via a couple intermediate neurons. And then, as you can see from here and here, one retinal ganglion cell receives input from a whole bunch of photoreceptors, but they're not all telling the retinal ganglion cell to do the same thing. The photoreceptors in the center of the field are saying, hey, something's here. Go tell the brain that. The photoreceptors on the outside are saying, nah, nothing's here. Tell the brain that nothing's here. Just darken that spot of your vision pretty much. And so because of that, now you have these regions here where in the center of these intersections, it's saying, hey, there is light coming from here. I do see the color white right here, but the areas around it are saying, hey, we see the color light, so we're going to tone down the center area here. And you have 4 areas of intense brightness around the center compared to 2 areas around the center not in an intersection. And that, again, is why the Hermann Grid Illusion happens. And now, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial for both the computer science and biological aspects of it. That's one of my biggest goals for this channel, is to give a little taste of both. And it's not just because I like both subjects, it's because both subjects heavily depend on the other. Myself, as a self-taught developer, I'm very used to the feeling of going through a lot of tutorials on YouTube and learning how to make many types of to-do apps, but in the real world, you are put out there and you have to solve real problems. And a lot of those are real problems that haven't been solved yet. And so what you need to get good at is not just making web components and things like that, it's solving problems and making solutions that make life easier for the end user. And so what we did here was we learned a biological concept and we used that to create a software solution. And then vice versa, my traditional background does come from microbiology, and that field is becoming increasingly computational. So much of it happens through bioinformatic techniques these days, and a big part of it is that you have so much conceptual knowledge, but at times it can feel a little lacking in the tools that you have to turn that conceptual knowledge into an actual end result. So wherever you're coming at this from, I do hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and stay tuned if you want more. For the future, I want to take this a little bit further, and I want to make this Hermann Grid interactive, just to explore how, because right now this is also in part, especially from the computer science part, it's a tutorial in how to use HTML Canvas, and the next thing I want to learn is how to make it interactive, how to set up web components like input boxes and select boxes and number inputs to change the size of the squares, because maybe the user might want to make the squares bigger or larger, make the gaps larger or smaller, and see how does that affect the illusion. I want to add little inputs to the bottom right that just have little numbers of the square dimension and the gap dimension that they have control over so that they can kind of play around with the optical illusion. If you like the sound of that, please stay tuned for more.